Good evening, everybody. Hello. Right, so I'm Richard Screeton. I'm head of the Alumni Relations team here at the university. Before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping announcements. Can you all ensure that your phones are turned off? We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way outside and wait by the Hyatt Hotel for further instructions. So, to our event this evening. Our events programme is an opportunity for you to hear about our outstanding research and to see firsthand how our campus is being transformed. You join us at an exciting time for the university as we publish our new strategy. The Our Future document has been informed by extensive consultation with colleagues, students, regional and national stakeholders, and you, our alumni and supporters. And we've got a short film featuring these people describing the future we want for our university. So I'm just going to show that now.
At the University of Manchester, our people have achieved great things that have helped define the modern age. We've pushed the boundaries of knowledge, opened doors to discovery and learning, and improved lives locally and around the world.
Now, as we approach our third century, it's time for us to once again consider our future. Our vision is to be recognised globally for the excellence of our people, research, learning and innovation, and for the benefits we bring to society and the environment.
This will be a place of research and discovery, where creative, digital and interdisciplinary approaches help us answer the world's biggest questions. We'll give everybody the space to develop and to thrive.
Through our teaching and learning, we will challenge and transform. Students of all ages and backgrounds will contribute to positive change, improving their lives and those of others.
We'll be the university for social responsibility, tackling environmental and social challenges head-on. Here, every single person will be able to make a difference.
We'll be an international powerhouse of innovation, where staff, students and partners are given the tools to turn unique ideas into game-changing reality.
We'll enter a new era of engagement with Greater Manchester region, will benefit our community, create opportunity, boost the economy, we'll get creative and celebrate our city.
And we will grow our global influence and reputation, attracting the best talent and collaborating with partners to amplify the impact of our teaching and research.
At the heart of all of this are our people and our values. Together we will achieve great things, working collaboratively towards our shared goals. We'll hold our firm values of knowledge, wisdom, and humanity, of academic freedom, courage, and the pioneering spirits we share with the City of Manchester.
All of our people, whether staff, students, alumni, or supporters, have been able to contribute to our new vision and strategic plan, and are vital to the success of the university. Together, our people will bring even greater benefits to our city, our country, and our world.
This is our future. Let's achieve it together.
So, as Professor Carey Cooper mentioned in the film, our people, including our alumni, are at the heart of our plan. So as we enter our third century, you can help us bring even greater success to our university, our city, our communities and our world. Indeed, the building that we're in tonight is testament to what can be achieved with the generous support of our alumni and our donors. You can read more about the university's strategic plan on the university website. One of our ambitions is to be recognised as a university that creates opportunity for the whole community, which brings me to our speaker this evening. Tonight we'll hear more about the university's role in creating age-friendly cities from Professor Chris Phillipson. Chris is co-director of the Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research on Ageing. He's also founder for the Centre for Social Gerontology and has received an Outstanding Achievement Award from the British Society of Gerontology. He was the principal collaborator on the AgeFriendly Cities project, which explored how to tackle social exclusion amongst older people. Now, understanding the relationship between population ageing and urban change has become a major issue for public policy. The case for this work is especially strong given that cities where the majority of people of all ages now live and where they spend their old age. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Chris to tell us more.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Can I just check my voice is okay at the back? Give me a good thumbs up. Brilliant. Okay. Well, I'm a sociologist, which means that I'm kind of interested in how society and social institutions work. But I'm also a social gerontologist, which I guess means how older people work, but I'm interested in how society affects and influences the lives of older people. And I started studying issues about ageing actually when I was an undergraduate in the 1970s. So it's been quite a long journey for me. And it's been a fascinating area. Actually, there are very few days that I don't wake up and think, oh, well, that's an interesting observation that I might make later on today about something to do with ageing. So last 30 or 40 years, it's really been a source of great fascination to me. And I think there are kind of a couple of reasons for that. I mean, I'll pull out a couple of figures in a minute. But, I mean, we make a lot about the fact that most of us are going to live longer, are living longer. But in a way, society, I think, is unsure about this. I mean, you know, we know of people having great lives in later life, but equally we know of people struggling and having difficult lives. And I think that tension about later life, is it a good thing, is it a bad thing? You know, what is it about being in one's 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on? I think that's an issue. The other thing that's fascinated me, and I won't talk about it too much tonight, but I've always been interested in transitions, particularly the work-retirement transition, which is where I started off my research. I studied a group of men who were making the transition from work to retirement in different occupations. And I was fascinated by the way in which, you know, they took it as a period where they were often reflecting about their life and their future. And I subsequently thought about ageing as a set of transitions which people make, whether it's retirement, whether it's around an illness, whether it's around the loss of a friend. You know, I think one can have, you know, a whole range of transitions. Anyway, I've been doing a variety of studies right up to the 1990s, and I suddenly realized, well, it's very interesting, but a lot of the work that I've been doing has been in cities. So what impact do cities have on people? And this is something that started to kind of enter into the research I was doing, I guess about 8 or 9 years ago. So it's become really the major bit of work that I do, apart from some residual work on work and retirement issues. So what I'd like to talk about, I'm going to give a bit of demographic context because I think it's quite important. Then say a little about the issue of urban ageing, how Manchester is responding, and Manchester is actually responding to the issue of ageing in cities in a very powerful way, I think. And then give you some insights, 3 examples from the research that I'm involved with, Manchester research, which is exploring this issue in the city, although not all of our research is in the city, but in the city and the region. But these 3 examples are. And then I've got 3 questions at the end, but you may want to ask a lot of other questions. But there are 3 questions which kind of interest me. Oh, just some statistics. I haven't got too many, but I mean, this is the kind of basics that we now have 1/3 of the population 50 and over. So that's a terrific resource. I mean, I'm obviously after studying it for 40 years, I've got to be positive about these issues, I think, and I hope all of you are positive as well. There's nothing to be gloomy about. Certainly nothing to be gloomy about. 30% of babies born in 2020 will reach their 100th birthday. Great statistic for you to throw around at future social events. I think that's an important one. And I don't know, the next one, 8% of men, 40% of women. We can talk about that gender differential perhaps at some point. There are these major inequalities. I won't cover these in too much detail, but they are very important, particularly in a Greater Manchester context. I mean, I've just taken here a contrast between 2 ends of the tram line, as my friend Kingsley Purdon puts it. Timperley on the one side. I'm told Timperley, I don't know Timperley, but apparently it's quite affluent. Some of you may want to challenge that, and I'm sure there are pockets of deprivation. But if you're a lady in Timperley, you've got a life expectancy of 81, which is pretty good. In Rochdale, it's much less good. It's 74. That's bad. That's bad. And that's true of a lot of, towns around Greater Manchester and elsewhere. Also very important, healthy life expectancy. The number of years expected to live in good health. Timperley, men and women, 74. Rochdale, 59. And that figure of 59 in Rochdale is particularly important because in the context of raising pension ages, 66, 67, 68, it means typically people will spend 10 years in poor health before they get access to a pension, perhaps longer, because that's just the average. A lot of people will clearly get poor health in their early 50s. I'm not going to say too much more about this. It's not the subject of my lecture, but I think this is a terribly important issue. And it's actually one of the reasons why having regional government is important, because potentially, hopefully we can use levers to address these issues. But it's a very serious situation that we're heading into. But I'll leave it for the moment, and you may want to come back at me on that at the end. So the big growth of population, I think, is amongst the population 65 and over, and the expectation is that will expand by about 53% by 2039 to reach around 650,000 people projected to. So a 1/3 growth in the population 50 and over. So it's for Greater Manchester, this is a very significant development. There's one other demographic point I want to make in terms of numbers. What's driving this is 3 things. One is migration inwards and student growth, and that's particularly affecting Manchester. But for Greater Manchester, there are 2 big significant booms, if you like. One is the post-war baby boom, people born in the late 40s, early 1950s. That was the first boom. And then the second boom, there was a dip after that, is the 1960s boom in the birth rate. And it's those 2 trends that are driving it. And you can see this from the changes from the 2001 to 2011 census, the peaks in terms of the percentage increases in people in in their 40s and people 60 to 64. And now, of course, if you can imagine it 10 years on, those people will be that much older. but it's those baby booms that are driving us. And I think they're very interesting in a Greater Manchester context, and we need to understand them more. Because the first baby boom, people in their, perhaps in their early 70s, I think to some extent will be a better off group because they'll have had a more continuous run of employment and a better opportunities to some extent in the housing market. The people born in the 1960s actually hit the labour market in a period of economic recession. Some actually never recovered from that and had long-term unemployment, and you can see that in the figures for Manchester. But it's a much more diverse baby boom, and of course also includes more people from minority ethnic groups, where there's certainly greater poverty. So my argument here is, I think, quite an interesting one, that for young older people, as it were, there's more diversity, possibly more poverty coming up than for people who are now in their 70s. I think we need more research on that, and do come back to me on that point. One other point on demographic pressures, and bear in mind I am a great optimist about all these things, but the job of a sociologist is partly to kind of bring out issues that we need to be worried about, and I think we should be worried about some of these issues, which we have to respond to. That 1 in 3 people 65 and over do have a long-term condition where activities are limited to a significant degree. So that raises all sorts of issues, obviously, about health services, transportation, and how we live. And I want to talk about that. Substantial increase projected in people who cannot manage one domestic task or one self-care activity. That's washing oneself or equivalent. And all of this in the context, and I don't think we make enough of this point, longer lives, fewer children. And I think that means a debate which we need to have about how we manage longer lives in the context of fewer carers who are available. Does that mean a more resilient family? What does that mean? How can we support carers better? At the moment, we don't really support carers very well at all. And some of you who may have big caring responsibilities within your family may know that to your personal cost. So I think there are, these very important issues. Now, one response in Manchester, but this is true of all local authorities, actually in England and Wales, is the idea of ageing in place, and the idea that more people, quote, will be supported to stay well and live at home for as long as possible. And that's a direct quote from a Greater Manchester document called Taking Charge of Our Health and Social Care in Greater Manchester. So I think this is the challenge that we have as to how to support people in their own homes for as long as possible. This is the challenge that has been set out. And I think the question we've got for this lecture, and what I hope you'll be stimulated to think about, is then how can cities support, cities like Manchester and regions like Manchester, support larger numbers of people living into their 70s and 80s and beyond. I mean, I'm a great optimist here because I think actually cities are the best places to grow old. Because cities, you've got access to great health resources, cultural resources. My strong recommendation to anybody is don't retire to the seaside. Surprising number of people don't accept my advice. And if I say retire to Stockport or retire to Rochdale or retire to Manchester, they look at me blankly. But no, seriously, I mean, undoubtedly if we can harness the resources of cities, cities are the places to live. I mean, you know, ideally live above Bridgewater Hall, something like that. Well, that would be good, wouldn't it? I think finding the right, if you could afford the flat. So we have got this concept, though, of age-friendly cities, which myself and colleagues have been working at over the last few years in Manchester. And it was a concept developed by the World Health Organization in 2007. And this is their definition of an age-friendly city: an inclusive and accessible urban community environment that optimizes opportunities. I think that's the key word there for health, participation and security for all people, to ensure life and dignity. And this network was launched in 2010. It now has over 1,000 members in the global north and south, although most of the members are in the global north. And Manchester, as I'll come on to, was one of the first members to join in 2010. This is a very fairly well-known symbol of the age-friendly city, which was seen by, as a result of research by the World Health Organization, to have 8 main domains. You needn't memorize these. I'm not going to test you on them after, but they're the kind of key areas which to work on and develop an age-friendly city, we should be trying to develop. And there are areas like improving outdoor environment, transportation, participation and respect for older people, health services, and so on. I mean, it's quite difficult to work on all of those, but certainly an age-friendly city is expected to be trying to develop activities around some of those activities. Why is this such an important area? And actually, this is one of the most important slides, I think, in my presentation. It was the bit of research which really got me thinking about this area, that 80% of the time of people 70 and over is actually directly spent in their home and neighbourhood. And you might say, well, you know, that's a pretty obvious finding. Till I got a sociologist to come up with something we all know. But it's terribly important, actually, because if the quality of that environment is poor, and remember what Greater Manchester is trying to do, that we should encourage people to stay at home, to live well at home, to age in place. But if the places in which they're aging are poor, if the neighbourhoods if there's a poor environment, then that's going to severely affect the quality of their daily life. And that's why I think, you know, this area is, this issue is so important. So let me just say a bit about this middle bit of my talk, is just to say a bit about what Manchester is doing in this area, and Greater Manchester, for those of you who don't know this. And then I'll move on and say a bit about what our research work in the university has been doing. So actually Manchester was the first UK age-friendly city, and it joined the WHO network in 2010. And there is a Age-Friendly Manchester, which has been working out of the City Council, developing a range of activities. I think there are at least three I've listed there which I think are important. Firstly, a focus on trying to develop age-friendly neighbourhoods, which I think means, in terms of Manchester, trying to get businesses, local businesses, to think about the needs of older populations and demographic change, and that can be a variety of issues there. It can be about trying to strengthen community groups and bring in different individuals, different groups, tackling issues like social isolation. That's been a very important theme. There's been the development of an older person's Charter of Rights, which looks at issues such as rights to security, healthcare and decision making. Quite a challenging issue in the context of austerity affecting services. There is an Older People's Board which meets on a quarterly basis and which has representatives from different groups across Manchester and discusses issues relevant to people in Manchester. But then there's the development, very exciting I think, of Manchester, Greater Manchester as an age-friendly region. This is much more recent, 2018. It reflected devolution. And the UK, Greater Manchester is still the UK's only, to date, age-friendly region. And a range of activities that have been developed, including collaboration with the London-based Centre for Ageing Better, particularly on issues about employment, trying to look at how we extend employment opportunities, improve working conditions for people over 50, particularly for those with long-term conditions, which is I think a major challenge. There's a big programme of work called Ambition for Ageing, which some of you may have come across, which is funded by the Big Lottery with £10 million with various projects designed to tackle social isolation in the region. And finally, one of the interesting strengths, I think, of Manchester work has been trying to look at the role of arts and culture in developing age-friendly activities. And there is a new initiative which has yet to get off the ground but has got funding from the Baring Foundation in association with Manchester Museum, where there'll be a major initiative looking at how the various arts organisations across Greater Manchester can be harnessed to improve quality of life of particular groups of older people. I think that's going to be a very exciting development. And all of that is pulled together by something called the Greater Manchester Ageing Hub, which is a strategic body which reports to the Greater Manchester Reform Board. And I'll just say what the priorities of that hub are. Firstly, to think about what's the future implications of demographic change across Greater Manchester. And there are different issues here in relation to more people living into late old age with various conditions, disabling conditions, which will need responses of various kinds, more people living alone. And that need not necessarily be a huge challenge, but maybe if people have limited resources. And I'll come on to make a point about that later on. There's a commitment from Greater Manchester to develop the region as a global centre for research into ageing, and that brings together all of the universities to look at all of the strengths in ageing, which are considerable across the universities, to really flag those strengths up. And finally, to look at issues about extending working life, which in the context of raising pension ages is, as I was suggesting earlier, one of the biggest challenges facing Manchester, where there is still high rates of unemployment, high rates of economic inactivity across groups from midlife onwards, and helping people to achieve working through their 60s is going to be a massive challenge. So I think having a regional dimension to that is very important. Okay, let me then talk about, I mean, that's the kind of general picture. What I'd now like to talk about is some of the research we do in the university in response to that. We have a small research group, Manchester Urban Ageing Research Group, which carries out different kinds of studies. And I'm going to just give you three examples. One from my colleague Tina Buffel, who has done a study working with older people as co-researchers. A second study which we're still developing on something called the Northern Gateway, and a third study on something called urban villages. And most of the work we do is very much collaborative, involving older people as researchers, consultants to the work, and of course other stakeholders, but it particularly has involved work with older people. The methodology we used has to some extent taken inspiration from Tina's work. Tina Buffel secured a substantial grant from European Union to develop a project which would train older people as researchers. So Tina ran a number of courses for groups of older people and trained those people in social research skills, interviewing, data analysis, people from the ages of 60 to early 80s. Two actually were former Manchester University graduates, putting their degrees to good use. So those individuals were trained. They went out into 3 neighbourhoods in Manchester and interviewed people who were deemed as potentially isolated, fairly marginalised within the community, talked to them about some of the challenges facing them in their lives. And it was done on the basis that it may be that if you're interviewed by your peer, it may be a more revealing interview in some respects than if you're interviewed by, I don't know, somebody who's simply a trained, a younger trained professional interviewer. And Tina generated some terrific material from this work. And the methodology has been picked up by the World Health Organization, who sees it as a model of its kind. And you can access, there is a book from this which you can access and download, and also a YouTube film which has the older people involved who were trained as interviewers and data analysts talking about their work. And the great thing about this project was that the group that was formed as a result went on to get further grants from Manchester City Council to do more research. So it was a really quite powerful study. The second example I want to give is something called the Northern Gateway, and it's been led by my colleagues Camilla Lewis, Sophie Yarker, Mark Hammond, and others. The Northern Gateway, some of you may have come across, is a residential-led development which connects the north of Manchester to the city centre and involves plans for up to about 15,000 homes to be built over a 15 to 20 year period. A mix of different types of housing and tenures, and quite a significant emphasis on promoting a high quality green environment. Now, so we've got interested in this project from the standpoint of what are its implications for generating a mixed age community? Would it be just a community for young families, or could it be a community where you bring together different age groups in a very positive way? We're also interested in it because the research which some of us have done on so-called urban regeneration suggests that it's often highly disadvantages older people. And I've just given 3 illustrations there, that it often is most advantageous to younger age groups, that it often produces greater social isolation for some groups. And also older people are often excluded from decision-making processes about urban regeneration. So we've been involved in a project trying to talk to some of the residents in the areas affected, running workshops, interviews and so on. And this graph is just an illustration of some of the challenges. So Collyhurst is one of the neighbourhoods where the urban regeneration will take place. And this graph just illustrates some of the issues faced by the older population in Collyhurst, that older people 50 plus in this case, that you have 47% living alone, nearly 2/3 of people 50 plus with long-term health problems, just over 2/3 no access to a car or van, and 81% of pensioners who are claiming pension credit, so are in certainly fairly low incomes. So the challenge here is how you develop an urban regeneration in an area where people are quite poor, and how they can be involved in that regeneration and not excluded from that regeneration. So we've written a report which you can access, which has a range of recommendations in terms of these sort of issues of equitable development, thinking about new ways of working with residents, and developing it as a lifetime community. We're now involved in the second stage of the research with Manchester School of Architecture, where we're inviting residents themselves to think about the kind of housing that they would like to have as part of the regeneration. Now, whether the developers would accept any of this or not, I mean, that's of course one of the issues, but we think this kind of work is important. Right, my final example. So I've got 5 minutes. Am I allowed 5 minutes? Right, okay. My final example is some research I've just finished, which was quite a difficult study, actually. And I got interested in something called the village model. We're back to ageing in place. How do we best support people who want to stay in their own homes, but may have challenges of different kinds? And in the US, there's something called villages, which, as this slide says, are self-governing communities. I'll give you an example. There are currently around 200 of these. This is the one example from in Ohio. So we have about 100 members of this village, people in their own households, their own homes. They pay the equivalent of £300. The village employs a couple of people. And what these people, there are volunteers from within the village. But what the staff do is do handy person things, help out with security, home safety, those sort of issues, which, for a lot of people, particularly in low-income communities, people living alone are a challenge. So I got very interested in this model and thought, well, let's see what we can develop in Manchester. So we've had a study over the last 2 years on the Brunswick Estate. which is just over the road, and in Levenshulme. And this has been a participatory study. We had a pilot phase run out of Brunswick Church and Levenshulme Inspire, focus groups and so on. And just to kind of give you a taste of some of the projects, just 3 of them. One of them was an intergenerational multi-ethnic group of women which developed personal support to help women through difficult transitions associated with divorce and bereavement. Often women who'd come to this country and had limited family ties. So it was trying to develop support in particular kinds of ways. Another project on the Brunswick Estate for older men living alone. There are a significant number of older men on the estate, a number of them with mental health issues. So this project tried to use cultural activities to bring the men together, men who often wouldn't come out of their tower block, to bring the men together, to take them out and use some of the cultural resources around in Manchester. And another project was called Meal Buddies, which has involved preparing takeaway meals to take to people isolated in Levenshulme with nutritional problems of various kinds. And this is a big question in Greater Manchester, where it's calculated that about 60,000 older people are at risk of malnutrition. So this was a project where volunteers took pre-prepared meals to people in Levenshulme. But the purpose of the meal was a social one, for people to get together, as well as nutritional, for them to have access to a good meal, which they wouldn't otherwise have had. So the conclusion we've had from this is that although there were none of these projects fully developed as a village as such, we think the lesson from them is that we need to bring people together in the sort of way that the American village model does. And I'll just come back to this because I personally think this is the future in some way. And actually, one of the reasons I agreed to give this lecture tonight was that I had to proselytize this particular model. So you see, I do think this is the future. And the reason I think this is the future is that we do not have the resources to support the very large numbers of people living alone in difficult circumstances. And the ageing in place policy, which all local authorities are pursuing, actually potentially condemns people to social isolation unless you have a model of this kind. But the model is difficult because in America this is predominantly middle class communities who do this. Middle class communities with financial capital, social capital, who use that in later life. And our challenge in Manchester is to do it amongst people with very little capital. So that's why we need to find the equivalent of this sort of model where we bring people together, where they get support. I mean, look, you're an 80-year-old living in Levenshulme. There's something wrong with your roof. There's something wrong with your tap. There's something wrong. Who do you go to? And your life, is a perpetual worry for many people because of basic things like that. So we need to find some answers. It may be that this isn't one, but I think we need to do something like that. So finally, right, 3 questions. So I think these are good questions to start, start a debate. Cities are viewed as, they're now viewed. I mean, cities are viewed more than nation states in terms of future of economies. But can we integrate ageing populations? I mean, if you come up the Oxford Road, what strikes you is this dynamic, thrusting Manchester. But can you integrate older people successfully within that? I think that's a challenge. How can we use the resources of the city to improve the quality of life for people in later life? I think we can, but I think we have to work at that. And can cities be designed in the interests of all age groups? So those three questions. I should say that I'm very grateful for various organisations who've given us funding, our group funding, and it's their support. I should have said that.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was fascinating. We've got time for a few questions. There is a roving mic, I think it is this microphone. So if you could wait until the microphone reaches you.
Yeah, I should say, one of the penalties of my ageing is hearing. And I can't wear hearing aids with the mic, it messes it up. So I'm sorry about that. I may struggle a bit with some of the questions, but I'll do my best.
So I think we've got one to the left there, and then one right at the back corner.
I always get a bit nervous at this stage, actually.
I wonder, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think so. I'll walk up. Do you mind if I walk up, just to make sure I get the...
Can you go back 2 slides? Because there was an interesting slide that you switched off very quickly, and it said something about the resources that are needed. The key question is, where are the resources?
Oh, resources, yeah. No, I agree. And resources, of course, can be of different kinds, can't they? And I think one of the challenges we have, if we're going to actually support people in their neighbourhoods, which is very much the policy we're pursuing, then we have to improve the range of housing options. We have to make sure that people are living in homes which are going to support them in later life, and that may mean issues about appropriate adaptations of various times. But all this does require resources, and actually if you walk around many Manchester neighbourhoods, you do realise the poor state of many houses, privately owned houses, and of course increasingly privately rented houses. There are a significant number of older people who still renting. And so there are these sorts of challenges, all of which can be, I think, overcome. But I think it does need a kind of very systematic policy addressing if we're going to do it. And that's where I am an advocate for this village model.
I think there was one at the back on the right, was there? Yeah. Can you pass the microphone along, perhaps?
I'll walk up again, just in case.
Thank you. It's a really, really interesting lecture. My name is Joanne Hardigan. I'm a councillor over in Trafford, and I'm the executive member for adult social care, and I actually chair our Age Well board.
Okay.
So I'm incredibly interested in some of the things you've said today. We are on the start of our journey, and we're learning very much from GM. But I guess my question to you is, with a backdrop of austerity, and with a backdrop of very poorly funded social care and still no vision for the future of what social care will look like as a funding model, what 3 pieces of advice would you give me as an executive member? 3 critical things that I should be doing with our Age Well board to really get some traction and change things for the residents of Trafford. Just interestingly, Timperley is in Trafford, and we know that we have some very affluent areas. However, we have a lot of poverty in Trafford as well that is masked because of the overall picture.
Yes, fantastic challenge there, which, I think, firstly, there's this challenge of healthy life expectancy, I do recommend here the all-party parliamentary group who last week actually published a report. There's an all-party parliamentary group on longevity, and they published a report last week, which has, I think, a number of interesting accompanying papers about the issue of prevention. And so I think my view here is targeting people, particularly people in midlife. Now, we define midlife quite generously as 40 to 55. Okay, but I think targeting people in that age group is particularly important, as I'm sure you're already doing to some extent. But I think looking at the kind of interventions, health promotion interventions which are taking place, and I think one of the strong arguments in this parliamentary report are, to how we can shift the emphasis in the NHS towards a much more preventative approach, and I think that is key. I think the second thing, I don't know whether I've got a third thing, but anyway, the second thing is this point about organisation. See, one of the things I learned from the Village project, and I'm sorry I had to kind of rather rush it, is that older people in communities now face a much more fragmented care system. I think if you're an older person concerned about health or social care issues, who do you go to? I mean, the NHS is fragmented, social care is fragmented, housing is fragmented. There aren't the monoliths that there once were, for good or bad. And that's the argument for trying to bring people together in some collective way so that they can have more negotiating power with your organisation, with your local authority. And although that may create problems, for you to some extent, I think it may also be better in terms of direct communication. We have written this report, which the Village, which hasn't been launched yet, but does have a range of recommendations, which I hope will be helpful in answering your question. And I think actually I may have listed it in the message that will go out after this. Yeah. But it's a great question. I'm sorry I haven't quite,
I think we've got a couple at the front, please.
Well, that's great if they're at the front. Oh, that's all right.
Just the chap there in the black.
Hello, I hope I'm not straying from the main topic, but
no.
I applaud your attempts to emphasize on prevention and mental health. But there are those people who have fallen and those who are not very healthy. And I didn't hear anything about how old people should be dealt with in hospital and in primary care. For example, there is an absolute tough rule in primary care that you have to come with only one complaint at a time.
Yeah.
You tell that to geriatricians, it's no possible. Only one complaint at a time. If you have other one, book another appointment. That's just an example. So what about gearing primary care and secondary care for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues that also came out of the Village programme was a group of older people who were trying to run their own health programme, to organise their own activities, to learn about good health promotion. And one of the difficulties they found was accessing advice through primary care. And I did wonder whether we, to some extent, I mean, the problem is the pressure on health centres and the pressure on primary care is so great. But I wonder whether, again, better links with groups of older people have got to be established to take some of that pressure off. Because at the moment, I think it's very difficult to get a dialogue between the two. I mean, health centres are under so much pressure. I think they find the task of educating beyond a one-to-one relationship very difficult. I mean, there is obviously talk about social prescribing, which I'm sure you're aware of, but social prescribing, I think, is still to some extent a medical model. We need somehow, I think, to link social interventions with the kind of medical perspectives from primary care, good primary care, and it's that linkage which I think we're struggling with at the moment, particularly in the context of multi-morbidity, of course, which most older people have, and certainly into their 70s and 80s, which I think is a big challenge.
Got the chat. Just
you said something in passing, perhaps in detail, about cars and not having a car.
Yes.
Is some kind of deprivation. Well, a few years ago, I had a big accident in my car when I was in my 70s, and cheap history. But anyway, the car was a write-off. So a couple of months later, we hadn't replaced